Tangled Hearts. Chapter 4. Cracks Beneath the Surface. Jack walked in with his usual air of calm confidence, the kind of energy that made people instinctively trust him. He was wearing his favorite navy blue jacket, the one Lara had teased him about countless times for being his lucky charm. When his eyes landed on Lara, his smile appeared, until he noticed David sitting across from her. His expression froze, just for a moment, but it was enough to send a ripple of tension through the room. "Jack!" Lara said, startled. She stood quickly, almost knocking her chair over in the process. "What are you doing here?" "I was just grabbing coffee on my way back," Jack said casually, though his eyes darted between Lara and David. "Didn't expect to see you here." David, for his part, remained seated but straightened up slightly, his eyes narrowing as he assessed Jack. The air grew heavy with unspoken questions and unacknowledged history. "Jack, this is David," Lara said, her voice strained. "David, this is Jack." David rose slowly, extending a hand. "Nice to meet you," he said, though his tone was neutral, almost guarded. Jack shook his hand, his grip firm. "Likewise." The exchange was brief but loaded, the kind of interaction where every glance and gesture carried layers of meaning. Lara felt like she was standing between two storms, and any wrong move could set them both off. "I should get going," David said suddenly, breaking the tension. He looked at Lara, his expression unreadable. "Thanks for meeting me. Take care." Before Lara could respond, David turned and walked out of the café. She watched him go, her emotions swirling, before turning back to Jack. "What was that about?" Jack asked, his voice carefully even. Lara hesitated, unsure of how to explain. "David, he's someone from my past. Someone I thought I'd never see again." Jack nodded slowly, his eyes searching hers. "And now he's back?" "I don't know what he wants," Lara admitted. "He says he wants to apologize, to make amends, but I don't know if I can trust him." Jack studied her for a moment, his expression softening. "Are you okay?" "I don't know," she said honestly. "Seeing him again, it stirred up things I thought I'd buried." Jack reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to figure it out right now. Just take your time, okay?" Lara nodded, grateful for his steady presence. But even as Jack tried to reassure her, she couldn't shake the feeling that her life was about to become much more complicated. Later that evening, as Lara sat alone in her apartment, her thoughts refused to settle. She replayed the events of the day over and over, analyzing every word, every glance. She thought about David's apology, about the regret in his eyes, about the way his presence had shaken her to her core. But she also thought about Jack, about how steady and dependable he was, about how he'd been there for her through thick and thin. He was everything David hadn't been. And yet, Lara groaned, burying her face in her hands. She hated this. She hated feeling torn, as though her heart was being pulled in two directions. Her phone buzzed, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was a message from Jack. "You sure you're okay? I'm here if you need to talk." Lara smiled faintly, her heart warming at his thoughtfulness. She typed back quickly. "Thanks, Jack. I'll be okay. Just need to sort through everything." As she set her phone down, another message came in, this time from David. "I'm sorry if I upset you today. I needed you to know how much I regret everything. Please let me know if you'd be willing to talk again." Lara stared at the screen, her chest tightening. She didn't reply. Instead, she set her phone aside and leaned back against the couch, staring up at the ceiling. Her life had been so simple just days ago. Now she was caught in a whirlwind of emotions. Her heart torn between two men who represented two very different parts of her life. And deep down, she knew that this was only the beginning. The days that followed were a chaotic storm of emotions for Lara. Her work consumed most of her waking hours, but no matter how many deadlines she met or tasks she ticked off, the thoughts of David and Jack lingered at the back of her mind like a stubborn shadow. She couldn't run from them, and that realization made her feel even more helpless. David's reappearance had stirred emotions she thought were long buried, and Jack's quiet concern only added to the pressure. Every time she tried to organize her feelings into something coherent, it all slipped through her fingers. One evening, Lara found herself sitting alone on the couch, her laptop open in front of her, untouched for the last hour. She stared blankly at the screen, the numbers and graphs in her presentation blurring together. Her mind wandered back to David's words in the café, his regret evident in his voice. He'd looked at her like she was his lifeline, the same way he had years ago. But this time, it was different. There was a heaviness in his eyes that hadn't been there before, a desperation that she couldn't ignore. Her phone buzzed on the table, pulling her out of her thoughts. She picked it up hesitantly, half expecting it to be another message from David. But it was Jack. Jack. "Hey, thinking about you. Let me know if you need anything." Her chest tightened as she stared at the text. Jack's unwavering kindness was both a comfort and a reminder of the storm brewing between them. He deserved better than the uncertainty she was offering him right now. Taking a deep breath, she typed out a response. "Lara. Thank you, Jack. You're always so thoughtful. Let's catch up soon, okay?" The reply felt hollow, but it was all she could muster. The next day, Jack showed up at her apartment unannounced, holding a bag of takeout and wearing an easy smile. "I figured you'd forget to eat," he said as he stepped inside. Lara smiled faintly, taking the bag from him. "Thanks, Jack. You didn't have to do this." "I wanted to," he replied, his tone casual, but his eyes serious. They ate in relative silence, the soft clinking of utensils filling the room. But the air between them was charged, unspoken words hanging heavily. Finally, Jack set his fork down and looked at her, his expression a mix of concern and resolve. "Lara," he began, his voice steady. "I need to ask you something." She froze, her heart pounding. She knew what was coming. "What's going on between us?" he asked. "You've been distant ever since, well, since that day in the café." Lara opened her mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. She felt a lump forming in her throat. "I'm not angry," Jack continued. "I just want to understand. If something's changed, if you're feeling differently about us, I need to know." His vulnerability cut through her defenses, and for the first time in days, she allowed herself to be honest. "I don't know, Jack," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I thought I had everything figured out, but seeing David again, it's brought up so much I thought I'd buried." Jack leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. So, what does that mean for us? I care about you, Jack, she said quickly. You've been my rock through everything, but right now, I need time to figure out what I'm feeling. I don't want to hurt you, and I don't want to lead you on. Jack nodded slowly, processing her words. His calmness made her feel both relieved and guilty. I appreciate your honesty, he said after a moment. But I can't just sit around waiting, Lara. I need to know if we're moving forward or if I'm holding on to something that's already slipping away. The weight of his words hung in the air, and Lara felt a deep ache in her chest. She couldn't blame him for feeling that way. Take the time you need, Jack said, standing up and grabbing his jacket. But don't take too long. I deserve to know where I stand. As he walked out the door, Lara felt tears welling up in her eyes. She sat there in the silence of her apartment, feeling the full weight of what had just happened. Meanwhile, across town, David sat in his car outside a small diner. His phone was in his hand. The screen lit up with Lara's name. He'd typed and deleted at least a dozen messages, unsure of how to express what he wanted to say. The truth was, he'd never expected to see her again. And now that she was back in his life, even peripherally, he didn't know how to handle it. The door to the diner opened, and Alex, his best friend, slid into the passenger seat. "You look like hell," Alex said, leaning back in the seat. "Thanks," David muttered. "So, did you tell her?" Alex asked, raising an eyebrow. David shook his head. It didn't feel like the right time." "There's never going to be a right time," Alex said bluntly. "You need to tell her the truth, David. If you want any chance of fixing things, you can't keep holding back." David sighed, running a hand through his hair. "What if I tell her, and it just makes things worse?" "Then at least you'll know you tried," Alex replied. "But if you keep avoiding it, you're going to lose her all over again." David knew Alex was right, but the thought of laying his heart bare terrified him. He'd spent years trying to forget his mistakes, to bury the pain, but seeing Lara again had reopened every wound. "She deserves better than this," David said quietly. "Then give her better," Alex shot back. "Be honest with her, and stop waiting for some magical moment. It doesn't exist." As Alex left, David sat alone in his car, staring at the diner's neon sign. He knew he had to make a decision soon, but for now, he could only sit there, paralyzed by the weight of his regrets.